and to have everyone physically and virtually with us. Our event aims to highlight Donatella's contributions and our deep appreciation for the highly distinguished scholarship, which everyone who has spoken has pointed out. We chose to do this by inviting young researchers coming from or working on Greece, whom Donatella either supervised as PhD students or postdoctoral fellows, to present their current work or to greet the occasion. A considerable number of these have been affiliated with the University of Crete. Thus, it is our great pleasure to host the event. In addition, we invited young researchers affiliated with the University of Crete Research Center for the Humanities, the Social, and Education Sciences. Now, for those who are not as familiar as all the participants and speakers in this workshop, I will mention just some highlights for Donatella's scholarship. She's professor of political science, dean of the Faculty of Political and Social Sciences, director of the PhD program in political science and sociology at the Scuola Normale Superiore in Florence, and head of the Center on Social Movement Studies, Cosmos. She has carried out extensive and influential research with global impact. Her citations are outstanding for about 45,000 by Google Scholar. This is just only a small indication of her high-level scholarship. Donatella has carried out research in the fields of social movements, political violence, terrorism, corruption, police, and protest policing. All these issues have become increasingly important in the 21st century, and we all will be going back to her writings, her numerous writings for decades. She has directed a major ERC project, Mobilizing for Democracy, on civil society participation in democratization processes in Europe, the Middle East, Asia, and Latin America. And as was said by the previous speakers, in 2011, she was the recipient of the Matei Dogan Prize for distinguished achievements in the field of political sociology. Donatella has already, and there will be more, I'm sure, has 4 honorary doctorates and a 5th one on the way from the universities of Lausanne, Bucharest, Gothenburg, Jyväskylä, the University of Peloponnese, and Cyprus soon. Words cannot describe her achievements. She is a prolific academic author and editor with 90 books, latest counting. Donatella corrected me if I'm wrong. 150 journal articles and 150 contributions in edited volumes. Major academic publishers of her books include Blackwell, Oxford University Press, Amsterdam University Press, Cambridge University Press, ECPR Press, Wiley, Routledge, Bergen Books, University of Minnesota Press, and many, many others, which indicate the high level of her academic outputs. I will take this opportunity to express my gratitude for the collaboration I had with Donatella. To her, I had the honor and pleasure to meet and collaborate with Donatella since the early 90s, and those collaborations that stand out for me particularly and which have inspired me deeply throughout the years have been the seminar on social movements headed by Bert Klandermans at the University of Amsterdam when I first met her in 1992, a conference organized in Crete by Nikiforos Diamandouros and his collaborators on Southern Europe, which led to our collaboration in a book that was not published, but was written, Sisters of the South, on the women's movement in Italy, Spain, Portugal, and Greece, by Donatella, Celia, Valiente, and myself. We also collaborated in an EC project on transformations of environmental activism, coordinated by Chris Roots, and also in the context of supervisions of PhDs, where Donatella invited me as external examiner. It has always been a special joy to work with Donatella, because she has a very kind spirit as a person. She's a wonderful collaborator, always, as Mario Diani described, making one feel very easy, comfortable, and for being mostly a continuous source of new knowledge and high inspiration for me and for many of us here. Thank you very much, Donatella, for everything that you have given us and will be giving us. And now the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So I had prepared a scientific presentation, academic one, and I will go to this one. But first of all, I wanted to tell you how happy I am today, how grateful I am for to all who participate in this event. A bit embarrassed, but very moved, especially. So I was thinking while you were talking about my work, about its development indeed, about my luck, because I think that to develop a career in social movement studies as in other fields, you need commitment, you need passion, like Guya said, but you also need to be lucky enough to encounter good people in good institutions. And so I was thinking, if I had to do a process tracing on my life, there have been several institutions that have been important for me, not because of the prestige of the universities, but because of the type of opportunities that they gave to people to develop autonomous and critical thinking. And in my life, besides the student time that were recalled by Sid, the École des Hautes Études, the European University Institute, where was the PhD students, the VZB later on, at the University of Florence, where I can say I started my academic careers. In fact, the European University Institute and the Scuola Normale Superiore have provided me windows of opportunities for developing a community of people, of committed scholars that have been able to build exchange among themselves. So I sometimes said, I feel like in a big Irish family, maybe similar to a big Greek family, where a large family means also that the children have to help each other. And so I was happy to interact with all of them, but also I was extremely happy that I could rely upon their ability also to collaborate with each other. They love for each other and their friendship. And I think it is true what Sid, Mario, and also other colleagues said. While, as this mentioned, people talked about the Donatella's people or the DDPs, it was not, I don't feel we are really a school. It's not a school in the French or the German spirit. But once one of the PhD students at my first, who always asked say, sincere, basic questions nobody thought about, told me, well, what do you think are our characteristics as the DDPs? And so I started to think, and it dovetails with some of the observations. I think sociological imagination, so the fact that we always have to go behind very quickly changing phenomenon, which means that we have to grasp for insights in different areas. And what I think I tried to stimulate, and I did myself, is not so much to try to build a closed school, but rather to be open and bridging is a term that has been mentioning different disciplines, different approaches, different concepts, and also I think one of the thing I'm most happy about is the fact that in all these places I could have interactions with scholars, PhD students, postdoc of very different countries. Once I counted 36 countries from which PhD students and postdoc came from. Maybe now they are more. And it is not just a matter of being international, but it is rather the fact that Taro once mentioned about the type of activist, deep-rooted cosmopolitans. So I think also all the PhD students, the colleagues that I interacted with from the different countries enriched the interactions because they were deep-rooted cosmopolitans, because they had not lost their roots. And empirically, I think also we have not been aiming for particularly sophisticated constructions of data and so on, but always paid attention to reality. So the attempt to develop empirical knowledge, I think, has been important, and the type of commitment to the truth. So I think that I've been lucky. I have to say I'm also optimistic. So I think that to a certain extent, some of the achievements that social movement studies could reach are also related with the capacity to build utopias, or to try to construct something new. And I think that the community of social movement scholars that I've been involved in is rich in debates, is rich in critique, but is also very much oriented in a constructive way to try to understand and help progressive movements. So I think I've been very lucky in having so many good colleagues. And in particular, I've been lucky to have so many Greek PhD students, postdoc, and colleagues in all the institutions. So I'm grateful to Leonidas, to Marcos, and to Hara, who are here, but also Konstantinos, Haras, Stella, Georgia, Partena, and Costis and Charles. And I think that it has been important for the development of social movement studies in Greece that they've been able to develop their own, in different ways, their own knowledge and contributions to this country. I also wanted to say before starting the more academic part of the presentation that I'm extremely grateful to Maria for having been such a good colleague and for the interactions that we had in all these years. And I'm very grateful to Maria, to Leonidas, to all Vasilis, Georgios, and the other colleagues of the University of Crete for the commitment they took in organizing this beautiful day for me in presence. So I'm glad if this is an occasion also to return in real, even if blended in this case. I know because we have done it in Florence a few weeks ago that it is extremely challenging from the point of view of all the regulations that one has to follow and to implement, but I hope that it will be also remembered as a day in which we could return to see each other and talk to each other in presence. And I'm extremely grateful to Sid, to Mario, to Charles, to Guya, and to Costis for their thought, and I hope that we will have an occasion to see each other in person. So thank you so much. And before crying, I moved to the scientific side, and what I was thinking to present today is the future challenges for us. Not only in living the pandemics, but also in trying to understand what is going on in terms of social movements. And said social movement studies, I think, developed in a pragmatic way, so eclectic from the theoretical point of view and pluralist in the methodological side. Also because we had to address, together with the movements that we were studying, continuous challenges that were always changing. And in the last decade, this was even more important because it was the decades of crisis, sudden changes, and critical junctures, needs to adaptations, and so on. So when the pandemic happened, I had just written this book, How Social Movements Can Save Democracy, in which I tried to see how movements were also to a certain extent moving on the progressive side, challenging the backlash. So I remember at a certain point in many conferences and also publications, social movement studies started to be concerned with the development of the backlash, the Great Regression, a moment in which it seems that what was rampant was more the reaction by regressive forces, not only in terms of the economic development, neoliberal capitalism, and so on, but also from the point of view of the victories of the radical right. And Italy was a case in point because together with the United States, the United Kingdom, Brazil, and some other countries, Italy with Salvini in power and their influences, was a case in which it seems that the wind had turned in a bad and negative way. But I think that this was only part of the story. So I thought it was important to study the right, but I think it was important also not to lose the perspective on what progressive movements were doing, because my impression was that we tended to react too quickly to changes. We had been very optimistic with the social forums, time, and with the anti-austerity protests. Not so optimistic in Italy because we didn't have anything comparable to what happened in Greece and in Spain. But we had the referendum against privatizations of water supply in Italy. So it was a moment in which we thought another world is possible, opening of hopes and so on. Then when at the same time Trump won in the United States and the Brexit won in the UK, I think there was to a certain extent also a cultural turn in which we forgot about the victories of the progressive forces and we focused on the challenges. And with this book, I wanted to sort of remind that a lot of positive developments were ongoing also on the left. When I finished the book, it was also 2019, the clear development of the new wave of progressive protest, progressive movement in Chile or Lebanon. So my idea was rather than just focusing on the backlash, let's look also what movements have done on the progressive side, which and especially which kind of lessons which we could draw from this. And another challenge from this book that I want also to develop today is the fact that it seems that the opening of opportunities had also contributed to blur the distinctions between the social movements on the one side and the institutions on the other. So in this book, I wanted to see also how progressive movements had interacted with democratic institutions. And in fact, looking at movement parties, what we have done with ARA, and others, referendums from below, that also seems to be again sort of response in a participatory forms to the challenge to representative democracy, but also the very contributions of social movements to constitutional politics towards the sort of crowdsourced constitutional processes. So we had these experiences in the past 10 years, and we had effects in the long term of these processes. And then the pandemic came, and on newspapers, but also in the public debate, a lot of focus was on no-vax protests, often very much sponsored by the radical right. And my attention with several research projects that are ongoing at the Scuola, among which one with Daniela is involved, was rather to see also what progressive social movements were doing in the pandemic, because the impression was that there was also a lot of mobilization in different forms on the progressive side. So much mobilizations that I think it was also unexpected to us, or at least unexpected to me, because the first impressions was lockdown means movements cannot move. So they are forced at home, they are, can say, constrained not to use the main spaces that were important for them. movements, I think, need empathy, need the physical encounters, cannot just go online. But so these expectations that the lockdown meant no more movements was sort of challenged by the immediate images that we saw of protests of different types in which progressive social movements have mobilized. So protests for public health, a lot of protests for worker rights, and Florence is an example in these days of the sort of re-emergence of protests in labors following sort of path of development of struggles for recognition. One of my master intellectual friends, Alessandro Pizzorno, mentioned them. So there were protests because, after all, the lockdown was partial. The workers were working and were working in very daring conditions. There was protest on climate that connected the challenge of the pandemic to the environmental challenge in general. This is the strike for climates conducted in the very first days of the lockdowns that showed that movements could be created also in conditions in which the physical spaces were closed. There were protests for civil rights. Israel or Slovenia were cases in point. And movements started to learn also, like we learn how to do conferences in, respecting safety measures. Movement also started to invent ways to protest in a safe way, to go to the streets, for instance, by bicycle in Ljubljana, by car in Tel Aviv, or with distant forms of protest. So they were protesting for social justice and they were protesting for democracies, and they are. So my concern in this sort of theoretical eclecticism, which I agree tends to characterize my work, was to think in terms of what can we pick up in existing literature about this type of time. Of course, these are exceptional times, and we know that this pandemic is different also from other pandemics in the past, that it was a time in which this exceptionality was stressed by not only by different sources, but also by our own perceptions. And so what I was looking at, what I was thinking about in terms of finding ways to not to predict the future, but at least to develop expectations that could be then analyzed empirically, was what is this sociologically a case of? Once Charles Tilly said, a sociological concept is a concept that indicates phenomena that developed empirically, more or less in the same way, to be a good sociological concept. So what are our times a case of? What can we find in reflections in literature in the past that can give us hints about what to expect and especially where to look for? So first, reflections was also based on empirical observations that times of pandemic times were times of movements, and there have been several special issues of journals like Interface, Open Democracy made a lot of published a lot of contributions, and Glasgow published a book. So there was immediate convergence of knowledge, saying that there were a lot of social movements during the pandemics, and that these were also on the left. So this is the introduction to these special issues of interface, which these colleagues wrote, "The world is on fire. With both fever and flame, after a few months of lockdown, things are erupting in new ways. Around the world, movements are strategizing about how to ensure that no one is left behind." And I think in this statement, there is at the same time an observation of the development of movements, but also an observation about the difficulties for movement to find a strategy, because they are different in terms of what to do in a new and sort of unexpected situation. And in a short book that I writing for Cambridge University Press, what I try to suggest is that progressive social movements can help saving democracy, but democracy understood as participatory and deliberative ones, by conceiving these times as times in which threat challenges have to be counted, but opportunities also can be enhanced. And in this, I think we are helped by some social movements work that has been developed on critical junctures of a particular type. So in this book, I try to develop the idea that we are facing an emergency, critical junctures related with health type of challenges. And so that we can look in literature on other disaster, catastrophe, health movements in order to try to understand the way in which the social movements are developed. So I tried to develop also on some of my recent work that tried to look at movements as source of changes and moments of reactions to critical junctures in which protest produces itself resources for contentious politics. So it is a critical juncture in the sense that there is a sudden break, and this is obvious in this case of the pandemic. It is a moment of crisis. So like we had in 2011, a moment in which the push for changes is related with the perceptions that what was going on before was no longer working. And with the pandemic, this discursive window of opportunity clearly opened. The first statement, nothing will be as before, are obviously challenged by the reality of it developed, but it is no doubt that there was also and still is a perception that deep changes need to occur. What I found useful in thinking about how social movements have historically reacted to this type of emergencies is the work on war, for instance, by Charles Tilly and Sidney Carros. Of course, epidemic and wars are different type of disasters, different also in the time perspective. Wars tend to develop in the long terms. They tend to have different type, even indicators of the type of crisis, larger number of people who died and so on. But I think what is similar is the fact that a huge number of people perceived that there was a deep change and a deep challenge to their everyday life. Scholars like David Snow and the others that have looked at the micro dimensions of social movement pointed at the importance of the disruption of the quotidian in producing the reaction. What is more, and what Sidney Tarr observed in his book on social movements during war, is that this type of disasters develop the need to impose high costs on the citizens, and that these high costs developed or helped developing sort of sense of deep injustice. And so that, like in wars, also in the case of the pandemic, the disruptions in everyday life was perceived to be something that was not just related to natural destiny or a natural catastrophe, but that was perceived as related with deep injustice and inequalities. And in fact, what we immediately saw during the pandemics was that the risks of the pandemics were not equally shared. So the idea that the virus is eating the same way different people was not truth. And what once Goran Tebot called the killing fields of inequalities became all the more visible with the pandemic. What Tilly and Taro pointed at is that in times of wars, this special type of critical junctures, the very need by the states to impose costs brings about the request by the citizens to be involved in further decisions and to be rewarded for the cost. So the famous statement by Tilly, states make war, but wars make state, I think to a certain extent could be adapted to pandemic type. A lot is demanded by the citizens, and then the citizens ask to be taken seriously. So, conflict-ridden societies is typical of wars, but is also typical of pandemic, and the fact that eventually there is a request for broader cities. So it's an emergency, and as Flickstein and McAdams suggested, time of crisis are also times in which the attributions of new opportunities and threats leading to the appropriation of creations of new organizational vehicles for the purpose of engaging in innovative, contentious interactions with other fields of actions emerge. So it's the idea of a rupture that is there and that brings about conflicts, the disruption of everyday life, conflicts around scarce resources, and the demands for being recognized. And then another literature that I found interesting in reflecting on this is the effect of health type of challenges in particular. So separated from social movement studies, a lot of scholars, among which also scholars in the medical tradition, have observed the effects of pandemics or epidemics in history. So from the pest to AIDS, this type of diseases had an impact on the way in which societies developed, how citizens' rights were perceived. So what research on health emergencies pointed at is the challenge that comes especially from airborne viruses. It's also, let's say, a very sophisticated analysis of which are the type of consequences which are related also with the different forms of contagion. We see it in the different developments of epidemics like AIDS and epidemics like COVID-19, with different effects on the populations. At the same time, and this is the point that I want to stress, the potential for creating solidarity, that's something that has been pointed at, is that moment of challenges are also moments in which networks in the society mobilize in a solidaristic way, but also moments of challenges because of the tendency to single out scapegoats, like those coming from outside, the refugees, the migrants, the poor, and so on. So this research on health emergencies, among which has been also fueled by the work of some important social movement scholars like Berta Taylor or Meyer Zold, tells us that health hazards are challenges to which social movements tend to react. What they tell us, and what I think is important to remember in our research, is that this doesn't mean automatically that the challenge will bring about either progressive or regressive politics, but that what is important is the social constructions of these type of challenges. So, for instance, if we think about AIDS, the social constructions that the gay movements was able to develop about this specific type of virus of sickness. And that what is important is the capacity of social movements to construct the social problems. So to construct the health type of hazard, not as naturally related, not as related to the personal responsibilities of the victims, which is one of the epidemiological tendency towards individualizations that this type of literature is singled out, but as a social problems for which you need social solutions of a certain type. So the need to connect the pandemic to a series of developments in our society, from the ones on climate to the ones on social inequalities, and to the ones which became very clearly focused upon during the pandemics, which is the effect of neoliberalism in terms of privatizations of the supply for health in health, public health to the different areas and regions. So I think that the contributions from this type of literatures point at challenges and points at opportunities. It points at the opening up of conflictual times and request, discursive opening for requests for social and rights for the citizens. But it also opens up to corruption, as we have seen in our countries in particular, but not only in this, also in Germany, also in the northern countries, opportunities for investment and opportunities for corruption. But it also moved different type of interest, and from the point of view of the challenges, the exclusions of some groups becomes even more killings than in normal times. On the other hand, there are also opportunities. So, for instance, the Spanish flu, this is a sort of immediate or most near to us type of pandemic related with a similar virus to the one of COVID-19 was called a virus or a pandemic that brought about the public health system in many cases. So there was a reformist movement in the health system asking for interventions by the states, and the Spanish flu acted as a trigger for the implementations of the welfare state, especially in terms of health. And so I think that what is important, other parentheses about war, the development was also quite similar. So war do not automatically bring about progressive developments. Some wars brought about dictatorship, but they are opening up opportunities. And so in this, Maria, how long do I have? How long do I have? No, as long as people will go away. We are fine. Okay, because as a work in progress, I want to point at this type of development, but also the fact that from the point of view of social movement studies, these pandemic times are times that have similar characteristics to the one of the last decades with the financial crisis. So a capitalism of crisis also means that movements tend to address similar circumstances. At the macro level, the type of contest means that time is understructured. So that's the type of contextual characteristics that usually are considered to constrain collective action are weakened. And in fact, like the work of Philip Schmitter and others pointed at in terms of the studies of democratization processes, those institutions, constraints, and so on that usually work in favor of stability of authoritarian regimes are suddenly challenged. And so these unstructured times also means that agency became more important. So in democratization studies, the agency that is studied, especially for the elite, but is there also from below. That contingency becomes more relevant because the structures are less able to constrain contingency. And so as also Mark Basinger pointed at in his research on the breakdown of the Soviet state, these are times in which movements can unexpectedly develop. And this is what we saw in 2011. Times in which movements develop more from threats than from opportunity. At the micro level, one of the observations is that in these understructured times, what becomes extremely important is the capacity of movements to signal changes. So that you have a sort of internal dynamics in movement in which, like we have observed in 2011 in Greece or in Spain, small forms of protest can grow very quickly on the basis of a sort of emulation, imitation, but also learning processes. So people going in the streets show that the regime is not so strong. People seeing other people in the streets start to think that another world is possible and that they can act. So a sort of empowering dynamics that comes from the capacity also of small groups to go in the street. And at the meso level, I think what we should pay attention to is this capacity of protest to become eventful, so to produce its own type of resources. And this is a sort of a point of reference that I think has been important in several moments in the years 2000s, in several reactions to different type of crises. So moment in which, as you will say, events are powerful in the sense that they can change the structures. So what the historians call the longue durée is important, but at the same time, there is also an eventful history, which means that sometimes the longue durée is not able to constrain the development of movements. And I think this is important in thinking about social movements, because it shows that protest is not just consuming resources from the environment, but is also producing its own resources, so that protest itself is able to develop organizations. So there is an organizing process during protest, that frames are not preceding actions, but they are formed during the actions itself. And that's the very development of repertoires is happening in action. So I think that this is important to observe, because it explains why also small protests, initial moment of solidarity, can produce their own resources, can produce the empowerment related with the impressions that something changes is important. And I think this can counterbalance a trend in social movement studies that had developed in the time of the establishment of social movement studies as a field of actions, that tended to watch at social movements, especially as normalized actors. So actors that act as other more institutional ones. What I think we see nowadays, but also in the last couple of decades, is that social movements are not acting just as strategic actors, but they also produce changes because they focus on norms transformations, and because they are emergent in this sense. So I don't want to talk too much because I want to listen to you as well. What I think I draw, and one can investigate more in depth empirically, is the ways in which progressive social movements have addressed the pandemics as an health emergency, which meant a lot of constraints on their actions, and also a lot of risks that the pandemic could be used by those in government in order to reduce the possibilities for participation. It's actually there in different degrees with different types of regime, but also that they have been acting in order to try to frame what is the pandemic challenge. And Bertha Taylor, Meyerhold, and those who studied especially crises related with health emergencies pointed at this particular relevance of the social constructions of the realities. What social movements of the progressive type did in this moment was acting in three different ways. So first, conclusions I draw, not in terms of the empirical research done, but in terms of what there is to do, is to broaden the spectrum of the type of social movement actions that we look at, considering protest and the innovations in the forms of protest that have been many, but also considering two other functions that social movements had also in the past, but became all the more relevant in the pandemic. One is what Lorenzo Bosi and Lorenzo Zamponi called direct social actions. That's in literature on the labor movements already is called mutualism, and means the development of forms of actions that are concretely and immediately oriented to intervene on the problems, developing solidarity initiatives, but which have a special function because they are not oriented just to provide help in like a charity, but they rather have constructed networks, very often informal and starting with a very narrow local range of activities. But in the logic of the development of actions, this type of interventions, as it had happened during the austerity crisis, scaled up in terms of framing, going from help to the singling out of responsibilities, and also scaled up in terms of organizational structures, constructing networks between also different types of groups. And building upon the already existing type of new mutualistic forms, like the cooperatives that Leonidas was showing me today, but also involving new generations, new type of groups, and also people who organize themselves for the first time in order to help the neighbor in need, but with the process that was transforming on conceptions and building bridges. So from the organizational point of view, also connecting different grassroots initiatives. And also the networking, I think, was moving on the similar dynamic than, as it had happened during the financial crisis. It started with needs of helping each other, of getting in contact with each other because of the necessity to face a deep challenge, but then developed into something much more structured, emergent, and potentially there to stay. And the other elements which I think is important to consider is that besides being in the street and besides organizing for helping the others, these social movements that I started to study are also actors producing another knowledge. And this is important for social movements in general, but it is all the more important in the pandemic time, which fake news, post-truth societies, and so on, are hitting hard also in the communication forms of social movements. And so the constructions of different forms of knowledge, from alternative pedagogy, to teach people how to say, protect themselves from the virus, to the denunciations of different forms of exploitation, to the actual deliberations and constructions of alternatives in a situation which is largely unknown. I think it's very relevant. And in all of these forms, what is also interesting is to see how the use of blended modes, so of alternative forms of communications, but also the need for physical encounters is relevant. I have many other slides, but I want to stop here because I want to listen to the others and debate, and I will show you the other slides the next time I come.
Great.
Pandemic.
Thank you so much. This is very enlightening and gives us a lot of food for thinking how to approach this new era in front of us. Thank you very much, Donatella.